Thank you so much, Brian. Good morning, all. Pleasure to be here with you on behalf of the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism, CICTE, of the Organization of American States to discuss security in the Western Hemisphere. I think before I get started on the conversation, I'd like to introduce General Andrew Croft, Deputy Commander at Southcom. I'm very honored and pleased to be able to have this lively intellectual discussion on some of the major security issues facing the Western Hemisphere, both today and in the years ahead. We know that Southcom has numerous partnerships in Latin America and the Caribbean and has significant visibility on regional security issues. And so, General Croft, we look forward to learning a bit about your perspectives. I think I will turn it over to you for some opening remarks.
Great, thanks, Alison. It's an honor to be here today with all of these esteemed colleagues. I'd like to thank Dr. Rosenberg and then folks on the line, Dan Erickson and Juan Gonzalez from the NSC and our DASDs, and then particularly Vice President Barr. That's great to have such a wonderful audience here today. By way of introduction, I'm Lieutenant General Andy Croft. I've been at U.S. Southern Command in the headquarters here since the beginning of the year. And prior to that, I was the Air Component Commander to Admiral Fowler in my previous position. So I've been involved with U.S. Southern Command for almost 3 years now, and I'm fully aware of the challenges and threats that we face in our region. So I'll just do a few introductory comments here. Alison, I think I'll take 10 to 15 minutes or so, and then we'll go into some comments and questions. And I'll try and relate some of the things we're actually seeing as we travel around and engage with our partner nations that will help sort of build this conversation. And I looked at the itinerary through the rest of the week. You have some great speakers, Dr. Fauci included, that will really illuminate some of the things that we are faced with in the region and the challenges that we're faced with. So the first thing I'll mention is just the vision of U.S. Southern Command. I think Admiral Fowler has shown this before, but we have a vision, and I was looking behind Dr. Rosenberg, and the things that stand out in the Western Hemisphere for us as a vision is secure, free, and prosperous. And that really reflects also what I see behind Dr. Rosenberg as well. So what does that mean? How do we as a military organization working with others secure those objectives in the visions? So I'll just go through a few things I think I've seen. The first one is it's a great venue here with having 2,000 people online. However, I'll tell you that doing these events in person is truly, truly important. So as we move forward and we emerge from the COVID restrictions, I think we've learned a lot in the virtual environment. And at some point, we're going to have a blended or a combined in-person and virtual options so we can get to the widest audience, but at the same time, we can do things in person. And a couple examples of that. Admiral Fowler just returned from the Dominican Republic a few weeks ago from the Caribbean Security Conference known as CANSEC, and we made every effort to do that in person as much as possible. It ended up being a blended option, but I can tell you that for many of the ministers of defense and chiefs of defense, they had not been outside of their countries for more than a year, and actually a few were brought to tears when they actually saw each other because it had been so long since they had been able to do any kind of face-to-face engagement with their counterparts. And it was really a powerful event, and it really proved the value of doing these things in person, if at all possible, but we're also bringing other folks in virtually so we can get maximum participation. So it's a balance of cost and also benefits. The second point I'd make is the challenges in our region, which I'm sure will be addressed throughout the rest of the week. But obviously, the underlying challenge right now, or the key challenge, is just the economic challenge posed by the COVID environment on many of these nations, and then some of the underlying challenges of things such as the fragility of institutions, corruption and violence, transnational criminal organizations, and what Admiral Fowler would call the vicious circle of threats that we're faced with in the region, which are those things that I just mentioned. And then you overlay COVID on top of that with the economic depression that's occurred somewhere between 8 or 9% of GDP in many of these nations as far as a retraction in the last year. And that just makes the situation worse and also enables nefarious actors to enter into the narrative here and have undue influence on some of the nations in our region. One thing that we have done in U.S. Southern Command to assist is our humanitarian assistance program. And in the last year, we have donated over 500, I'll call them events of things such as ventilators, PPE, field hospitals, and the like to try and support nations as they are faced with the increasing challenges of COVID. And interestingly enough, if you look at our region, the infection rates in various nations vary widely. So as some decrease, some are increasing, and it's not an even effect on the nations, which makes it a challenge for us because that results in different restrictions and rules in those nations as you attempt to travel around and engage. And so in many cases, every region or nation is somewhat in a different position based on the status of where they are in fighting COVID. And that's a challenge which I'll address here a little bit in the future. We have a new administration in place, as you're aware, and one of the things that now is also brought into the narrative is the environmental challenges. So I'll just give you an example of that one, right, that I just witnessed firsthand when I went to Martinique and Guadeloupe in the Eastern Caribbean just middle of last week. I went out with a small team to Martinique to meet with the French military folks there. Admiral Hauserman is the commander or vice admiral. And they were executing an exercise called Caribes 21, which is an HADR exercise on the island of Guadeloupe and its nearby smaller island in conjunction with the Dominican Republic. They had not done this exercise in 7 years, so it's the first time they had restarted the exercise. A very important HADR exercise to support the citizens, up to 1 million on those islands. And to do it in person was really an effort, and it was completely worth it. So the first thing that we did was just try to get to Martinique, which if you've traveled in the Caribbean in the last year, you understand how difficult it is. One flight a week, for instance, and so unless you can get some other kind of form of transportation, it is very difficult. The second one is, and this is what we see across the region, is every nation generally has a different policy for entering that nation and departing the nation, which makes collaboration across multi-nations very difficult. And I'll tell you, frankly, the easy answer is just to not do something and to cancel it. And we end up losing ground every time we do something like that. So that was really driven home as we engaged with the leadership to include media, provincial leadership, mayors, and the like. Doing it in person, they had not seen each other in over a year in many cases, and many had never even met each other before because there had been elections that had happened in the last, say, 15 months or so. So that's one point I'd make as far as travel and the challenges. The second one is the environment. So firsthand, we saw this on the eastern shores of these islands, Martinique and others included, is a massive influx of, it's a bad algae. They call it Zagros, but essentially it's almost like the red tide that you have in the United States. It's this algae that is a result of a couple of things. One is higher levels of nitrates in the ocean, and the other one is the warming of the oceans, which generates this very foul-smelling, sulfur-emitting algae, which sucks oxygen out of the water and actually inserts a bit of poison in there as well. And so if you are dependent on tourism, which in this case in Martinique makes up 80% of their economic engine or generation, you're not going to go to the beach if you have this foul-smelling algae right offshore. And it's bad enough that they actually joked to us that you could actually walk to Africa on this, almost like a land bridge. If you could walk on the algae, there's so much of it. And they were trying to pull it out of the ocean. They had these big backhoes pulling it out of the ocean and dumping it on the land. I asked them if it has any economic value. They said yes, but it's not predictable. But the interesting part is this has only been a phenomenon for the last 6 years. So it started in 2015, and it started to show up more and more. And it's going to hugely impact the ability of the islands to bring back tourism. And if you add that to the challenges of COVID, you can see that much of their income is going to be very, very limited. Their other form of economic activity is sugarcane production and milling, I'll call it that. And in Martinique, their one mill burned down. So now they have to export the sugarcane, which makes it even more challenging. So here's an island that from 100% of economic activity has probably been reduced to 10%. And it was really, really evident. So those are two challenges that we see if you're looking at the impact of COVID and then also the impact of the environment. So what are some actions we can take? So from the military side of the house, we can do things such as COVID support with PPE that I mentioned. And then on the other side, getting after the vicious circle of threats, our partnering with other military organizations is really important because in many cases, they are trusted organizations in their nations. Not always perfect, we acknowledge that, but we're always trying to improve our partnering, and that is through exercises, readiness, military professional education exchanges, which are very important to us. And so we're going to continue to work towards these in the next coming year. On average, if you look at a fiscal year, we do over 1,000 operations, activities, and investments with the various nations in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. So not insignificant. And we just did a commanders conference last week where we identified the top 250 or so to look at our strategy to try and assess, is our strategy aligned with who we say we need to partner with based on the current situation that these nations are in, to make sure we're aligned. And that's why we do events like this, to make sure that we are aligned, not just on the military side, but also on a whole of government and including our academic institutions. And that's really, really important. And I think you'll see that emphasized here in the future. A couple things that Emil Faller likes to talk about is he likes to dispel in our region 3 myths. And I'll just review those for you really quick because he would tell you this if he was here. The one is the influence of the People's Republic of China in our region is not just economic. So it's more of an effort to do more of strategic dominance. We see it with what we call state-owned enterprises in things such as port deals and other areas of activity, to include mining, logging, and illegal fishing, which I'll talk about IUU here in just a minute. But it's not just purely economic, and that's, I think, something that is often looked at. The next one is that our transnational criminal organizations, it's not just drugs. They'll deal with any commodity that's available, and it undermines the stability of the nations that we're trying to assist. And that leads to fragility and lack of economic activity, which really requires security and stability in the institutions of those governments. And the third one is that the U.S. military does have a role in stabilization efforts through the efforts I just mentioned. And our challenge, I'll tell you frankly, is that as we work through the next national defense strategy and the national security strategy, is trying to include those themes in those strategies because it allows us to maintain focus and priority. And so those are very important things. And like I mentioned earlier, our over 500 humanitarian assistance projects done through our J79 division has helped out immensely over time. And I believe that at some point here later in the week, you will get into vaccine discussions, but clearly there's a need globally for vaccines from all nations. And I think that's going to be a very important discussion that you all, I think, will have coming up here in the future. Some other things I'll mention is other areas of cooperation, and then Alison, I'll go to questions here in just about a minute or so, is things on cybersecurity. We can get into that discussion. Partnering in space. So we tend to focus in domains such as air, land, and sea, but clearly cyber and space are global domains. It's not a regional problem. It's a global problem in many areas, and we saw an example of that in the U.S. here just about a week ago. And the last one is the IUU fishing. If you read the Wall Street Journal, a very interesting article a few days ago about the People's Republic of China IUU fishing effort, 15 ships in 1985 to over, they estimate 17,000 ships now in their deep water fleet, even though the number should be around 3,000. If you look at Taiwan and South Korea combined, they have 2,500. So you can see the scope of the effort. And we see it in Africa. We see it in our region as well, particularly in the Galapagos Island region, where you have well over 300 ships that use really large, in many cases illegal nets to essentially take out the fish stocks. And that affects the economies of the region, especially the coastal countries, which then drives them towards other things such as supporting drug dealers with fuel or provisions because they are unable to make a living in their primary source of income. So that's another one I think that is important to illuminate. And we can help with that because we do a lot of things such as domain awareness, which will allow us to illuminate those other nefarious efforts. So Alison, I've gone a minute over my time, but I'd like to go into the Q&A, and I'd appreciate comments, questions, or anything else that we're seeing. And then at the very end, I'll wrap it up with a few vignettes if I could. Over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, General. I'm going to try to build off of some of the issues that you have just raised, and I may throw in a couple of additional areas as well. But let's come back to one of the factors that you've mentioned, which is the economy or economic factors, and the linkage of that to our region's security and stability. So you've addressed some of them. We know we've got a significant issue with irregular migration flows in the region right now. We know we have a significant issue countering transnational criminal organizations, which, as you rightly point out, are not just trafficking drugs, weapons, and people, but also carrying out a host of other illicit activities, such as illegal fishing. We also realize this is an increasingly significant problem. So through the years, we know there's been a lot of analysis regarding the push and pull factors underlying these problems in Latin America and the Caribbean, including the economy being one of those significant factors. So building on your previous comments, sir, how do you think security systems in our region can complement efforts to promote greater prosperity in our region? Are there any lessons learned that you could share with us?
Yeah, so I'll say in that area, so I'll look at the push factors, the factors that push people towards our borders. Obviously, the lack of economic opportunity, the threat of violence. I live in a house here in Miami that is owned by a Colombian expatriate. She left Colombia 20 years ago because half of her immediate family had been killed and they wanted to get out of Colombia. My next door neighbor on one side is Venezuelan, the other one's Colombian as well. So you see the importance of those nations' diaspora here in the Miami area in the U.S. But it's a consistent problem set over time. And one of our challenges, Alison, is that as we look backwards 20 or 30 years, you have a variance in the ability of partner nation governments to align or be maybe misaligned with our own government. So it's difficult to engage on a consistent basis over time, whether it's professional military education or exercises or investments. If it's episodic, it makes it difficult to generate increased security over time, to generate institutions that are stable, static, and corruption-free without a consistent engagement strategy, which it's a reality of life that the political winds of change will affect that. But trying to keep it consistent over time is what we can offer. So we have things like the Inter-American Defense College in Washington, D.C. We have service professional military educations from all services. We have IAFA in San Antonio. Those institutions over time build those long-term relationships that can survive the ebbs and flows of our relationships with individual nations on the political side. So that's one area that we see over time that really generates return on investment. And then as we come in and we do exercises together, we can build some capacity in the military and forces, which enables security for that nation to avoid corruption and violence at home, so it avoids pushing people towards our borders. I think one of our challenges right now in COVID is many of the folks that have lost their jobs are in service industries. Same thing in the United States. That's the biggest area affected. But trying to get those back, and that's tourism and travel, is really going to be important. And I mentioned earlier that one of the challenges is that every nation in Central America, South America, the Caribbean is going to approach this a little bit differently, which makes anyone trying to negotiate through this very difficult. Imagine being a cruise line. You're trying to restart sailing in July, but you can only go to half of the nations that you normally went to. It just limits your options. And so trying to build these economies back in a synchronized method is going to be really important, so that we all are able to travel with what I'll call simple rules. We've got to keep them simple. Even the U.S., sometimes we have not very simple rules for people to follow, and so they don't know what to do. And they will tend to retrograde to the most conservative stance because you don't know what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do. We see that in our partner nations as well. Over.
Thank you. Let me pick up on a couple of the things that you just mentioned, and how the economy is affecting is being affected largely as a result of the pandemic. And I'm also going to touch on cybersecurity, which you referenced in your opening remarks as well. So let's look at the pandemic. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic is having a particularly devastating impact on the Western Hemisphere. To be precise, the World Health Organization indicated that just as of last week, 40% of the global cases and 48% of COVID-related deaths have been in the Americas. This, unfortunately, has clearly and painfully demonstrated that any sort of incident with the introduction and spread of a biological agent can have enormously detrimental impact on all aspects of our society. And help will be needed in many different ways. So as you said earlier, we know that there will be many more in-depth discussions of the security implications of the pandemic a little bit later on this week, including by Dr. Fauci. But I don't see how we could set the tone for this conference without at least a brief mention of the issue. So you spoke, sir, about Southcom's vaccine distribution plans and the PPE equipment plan. And so what we are seeing is sort of the linkages between vaccine distribution and the pandemic response and health diplomacy. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit about your perspectives about the interplay between vaccine assistance, diplomacy, and security assistance. How do you see this changing the security landscape, if you do?
Yeah, so we mentioned the importance of PPE, but clearly that the distribution of vaccines is going to be really helpful in getting us back to what I would call a more normal situation where we can actually increase that economic activity. So we work with USAID and others to support their efforts as much as possible. And then internally to U.S. Southern Command, we are just doing current planning to support whatever vaccine distribution effort will come forward. As you realize, there's different challenges with these different vaccines. So some nations, based on the cold storage chain that you have to maintain, may or may not be able to receive certain types of vaccine. So Pfizer the most restrictive because of the cold storage. Moderna's next. J&J is a little bit easier to distribute. But that's going to be really important as we move forward, that we understand clearly what each nation's able to receive. Do they have cold storage sequence figured out, and that we align those things, which is going to require a lot of coordination. So to avoid being either late or wrong, that's going to require a lot of coordination between all of us, and that's nation to nation coordination. And then we in U.S. Southern Command can support on transportation if needed, through Mobility Command and others. And then to your point on vaccine diplomacy, we do see it. So we do see other nations come in with offers of vaccine. Frankly, the offers, although significant in the press, percentage-wise, we need a lot more than what we're getting in certain areas. But we fully acknowledge the importance of that. The good news is the United States invested in multiple COAs or multiple companies to try and get the production going. And we largely succeeded with 3 vaccines on the market now that are all fairly successful. And so that was a successful strategy. And now we are ramping up production as well, which I'm sure will be discussed later on in the week. And then the question is, as we vaccinate the U.S. and there is now a vaccine to distribute, how do you do it? What's the priority? And then where do we go? And I think those are all really important points. And what we don't want it to be is late to need from U.S. Southern Command's perspective. So we will support the U.S. Government's whole of government effort in trying to assist. But that is clearly what's going to get us, I'll call it, over the hump to the point where we can get a downward vector. Although you see that right now in some of these, in our partner nations that were in a worse position, it's not good. But in some nations that you start to see the rates that have gone up have come back down again. Brazil, Chile are 2 examples of that. But clearly that's going to be the next focus, I would say, of our efforts as we go into the coming months. So a field hospital is important, especially if your hospital capacity is overwhelmed. But as those numbers come down, then vaccines are going to be the next most important thing. And we're just ready to support from the U.S. Southern Command perspective, and we realize the importance of it.
Thank you for that. And again, I realize we could talk about this easily for the remainder of our conversation, but I'm cognizant that we've got 20 minutes left and a lot of ground yet to cover. So let's move on to a different issue that has also impacted and affected every single country in our region, and that is cybersecurity. So if we look back to the 1990s, even the early 2000s, cybersecurity was just beginning to become a buzzword, if you will. But as technology has evolved, so has our dependence on that technology, and consequently, so has the scale, originality, and aggressiveness of the threat landscape. I probably don't need to cite examples, but I will. SolarWinds, the Microsoft Exchange attack, even last week's Colonial Pipeline cyber attack. These are just some of the examples that have clearly demonstrated the heightened level of vulnerability that both industry and states are facing. It is true that the examples I just cited maybe have more directly impacted the critical infrastructure of the United States, for instance, but ransomware, phishing, doxing, they have been on the rise across our hemisphere for several years now. And the pandemic has absolutely exacerbated the problem, which makes our need to stay ahead of these geopolitically or economically motivated criminals that much more critical. So regardless of the specific lens that may be used, and here I'm referring to either a cybercrime lens, cybersecurity, or even a cyber defense perspective, we know that strengthening cyber preparedness figures extremely high on everyone's agendas. So with that general knowing, right, in this world, in our world of growing interconnectedness, and with every day more and more decisions, key decisions, being taken by private actors, such as technology companies, how concerned are you, if you're concerned at all, that governments today are not unilaterally, are not singly responsible for security policy today?
Yeah, thanks. So I think about it is, if you went 10 years ago and you lost your phone, which probably wasn't even an iPhone then, how important was it? To today, if you lose your phone and it's not backed up, how critically important it is. I'll never forget when I got internet back in 92 or 93, I wondered, what value is this to me? And now it is completely invaluable. The other one that is included maybe in the cyber realm is our absolute reliance on global positioning satellites. People think about position, it's really about time. And if you lose that, that will have a huge effect on us as well. So space is involved in this too. To your question about governments, so here's one thing that we focus on, both on government and also private industry, is just cyber hygiene itself. So you've got to do it, whether you're a large government organization or you're a private organization, because they're inextricably linked together often. And in my opinion, the U.S. government can't, or the governments of these nations can't do it all. Private industry has to do it as well. But there has to be a common standard to which we hold our own systems. That's one. And then the other one is, how do we hold nefarious actors responsible for this when you can't find them? So it may be a state actor or maybe a non-state actor in a state, maybe condoned by the state or not. But the bottom line is the pipeline attack, for instance, is a criminal act, probably from outside of our shores. How do we find and punish those folks to make it a deterrent, instead of constantly defending ourselves, which becomes very, very expensive. So that's a challenge. And if you look at the narco terrorists, the one thing they fear the most is extradition to the United States and being put in a U.S. prison, because our prisons are not the same as some other prisons, I'll call them. So that's one thing you got to think about. But back to what can we do about it? Cyber hygiene, cyber security, sharing information sharing on threats that individual nations or organizations may see. How do you prevent other people from being attacked by the same threat? Because it'll be sequential. It won't be simultaneous. And the nefarious actors will find out ways they can get into networks, and they'll repeat it over and over again. So we have to share that information with not only partner nations and partner governments, but also in the security realm of private industry. And then you look at the vulnerabilities that we have to these things, and it could be just fear itself. You couldn't buy gas in Florida last Wednesday or Tuesday because everybody feared they were going to run out of gas, even though we weren't using any more of it. But it's just simply a fear factor out there that gets exacerbated by social media. So you bring social media into this as well, and you can immediately see how a very small attack could actually have a very large influence. If you look at our energy transmission stations throughout the United States, there's 8 major ones, and they are purpose-built, I'll call them transformer stations. Those are a vulnerability, as are pipelines and other things. So we have some key vulnerable points, and I think having redundancy and backup systems or backup processes is really, really important. You know, I think back in the day when I was a kid, you know, our phones were powered by static electricity. So when the power went out, your phone worked. Well, now that doesn't happen anymore. I mean, we are totally reliant on computer networks, and we've put things onto networks that we now cannot work around if there's an attack. When Hurricane Michael hit the panhandle of Florida, it knocked out all the cell phone towers, and the only way to communicate, and the worst part of it, was with a satellite telephone powered by a generator. So you got to think about the worst day and sort of build yourself up from that. And how do you work through those challenges, whether it's man-made or it is the environment doing it to you? They are very similar sometimes. And so cyber defense, cyber hygiene, sharing threats, sharing information, having redundant systems, not relying on a single source of, I'll call it data passage, is going to be truly important. And I think we've sort of consolidated our communication networks. We need to disaggregate them a little bit and make them a little more federated to give us some resiliency. Whether you're a bank or you're a government or you're a military, I think all these things are going to resonate. But we've become so reliant on speed of information that we've made ourselves vulnerable. And then I could go on and on about space too, but that's equally important. So over to you.
Yeah, agreed. As I'm saying, I'm struggling a little bit with where to take it. I said we have so much information to cover, but let me pick up on something you just said. We'll move on from cyber. You've just talked about the nefarious activities of non-state actors, and you referenced to thinking about the worst day. And so that's a nice segue for me to sort of take this conversation in a slightly different policy discussion direction. And it's honestly incredible to me, but in just 4 short months, we will be recognizing the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And I think we could all agree here that there has been no one single event that has so radically altered global, hemispheric, and even national security consideration than the events of that terrible, terrible day. So international organizations such as the UN, the OAS, have created committees, treaties, resolutions. We know that governments, as a result, establish laws, put into place protocols and strategies, all in this effort to help thwart future attacks. So almost 20 years later, in your opinion, have these efforts been enough? Have we as a region learned? Have we prepared to prevent future incidents, terrorists, or even extremists? And if not, again, building here on your earlier message of resiliency, what else do we need to do to ensure that we are prepared and more resilient as a region?
Yeah, it's a good point. So I think every one of us on the line here, if you were old enough to remember it, knows exactly where you were standing or what you were doing especially when the second plane hit the second tower. That's when you knew. I could tell you, I knew exactly where I was. So the response was, I'll call it massive. We spent trillions of dollars on Afghanistan and Iraq response, and also securing our own nation. You know, the TSA didn't exist before 9/11, and now there's thousands of people in that organization. So I think the response was appropriate. We invested a lot of resources in trying to secure the nation abroad and at home. And I think what it has done, the negative impact of that is if you combine that with the end of the Cold War, we sort of taken our eyes off the long-range competition ball, which the last couple of administrations have maybe tried to push back that direction with various levels of success. And you see that we're going to depart Afghanistan after 20 years. Right or wrong, we put a lot of effort into that. I think the challenge for us is to not remain static. So if you are an enemy of our nation or our partner nations, you're going to look for weaknesses. And we have a security apparatus set up to counter what was a threat 20 years ago. We need to look at the current threat. And like you said, it could be cyber, or it could be something else that's actually non-physical, but it causes a physical impact. So we need to remain agile. We need to keep our intelligence operations, I'll call them, well, agile as well, or innovative. So we're not looking for the same old threat and we get surprised. I mean, if you could have gone to the year 2000 or 1999 and said, here's what I think 9/11 will look like, and you would have told us that we would have had no clue what was coming, or we had pieces and parts of the intelligence, but no one was able to put it together to figure out what was actually happening, and the level of, I'll call it, success that they achieved, you would have thought that would not be possible. So how do we prevent that from happening again? But we don't grind our own resources into the ground, and we're not able to focus on other things. So it's a balancing act. We have limited resources as a nation and as a military, and they're going to become even more challenging with the amount of debt we've just incurred. So how do we spend our investments wisely and look for the future threats, but at the same time keeping our eye on the long ball? And so I think we will move ahead. We'll see how the security environments develop in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria over time. But I think it's time to keep our eyeball on the new threats that are going to threaten our homeland, but also keep our eye on the long ball as well. And you could say our attention has been diverted for the last 20 years to violent extremist organizations. Well, we had to do it. It was a requirement. And you look at countries like France; they're still fighting it. It's a real-time fight to this day. And so there's certain nations that are still very challenged in this area. So a tragic day. Response was required. We spent a lot of resources to do it, and I think we have to balance current threats with future threats instead of focusing all on one and not on any on the other. And then keep our imagination going as to how would you, as a nefarious actor, impose costs on us, and then we look at that from the intelligence perspective and response. And then the administration's focused on allies and partners. Critical asset. If you look at the PRC or Russia, who are their allies and partners? The list is very short. We have a tremendous alliance, organization, partnerships with other nations. We should rely on each other and help each other out instead of trying to do it unilaterally, because one nation can't do it all by itself. And I think that's a true, powerful weapon that we have. And that's why engaging with our partner nations, especially in the Western Hemisphere, is so critically important. You know, Admiral Faller, he WhatsApps mods and chods constantly. And that's really important. So they are his friend and he is their friend. And often we have different levels of communication, but that's an example of consistent outreach at the personal level that is critically important when you have to move, especially quickly, in response to whatever the threat is, whether it's COVID or a TCO threat or anything else. Those constant connections, like we're doing today, are super important. Over.
Agreed. Thank you. Let me just follow up quickly on that point because, again, very mindful of the fact that you are representing Southcom and knowing that other defense authorities are here and participating. I'm just wondering, again, just sort of circling back to your original comment and just these recent remarks, right, about how the threat cycle is a vicious circle. Is there something here specifically that military commands can do? Any more so than the examples that you've just used, but here, just looking specifically from a defense perspective, is there something else specifically that the militaries of our region should be looking at?
Yeah, so I'll try to give some specifics to us in the region. So the various partner nations we work with, they have air capability, land capability, sea capability, cyber and space we mentioned. It is critical that we understand where we can assist them to build a capability. So I'll use a near coastal patrol vessel, for instance. A lot of activity happens right in the near coastlines of these nations. How do we help them secure those areas? It may be something simple as helping them maintain their boats or acquire a new capability, something that's not too complicated that we can actually maintain over time. That's one of our biggest challenges, is we help them acquire an asset, but then you come back 3 years later and it's non-operational. So how do I identify those areas where we can partner, whether it's air, land, or sea, or otherwise, to assist them in the areas that give us the most return on investment and it helps them out the most? that requires consistent personal engagement from not only our staff, but also our different components. And so we continually do that. And it's been a challenge, I'll tell you, in COVID, because we just haven't seen them in a year plus. And often you don't know what they really need until you're actually talking with them at a social event or after a meeting or before a meeting, and you get the true picture of what they really need, which is something that's very difficult to get through. So I'll call it a staffing process. So engaging our various directorates and components to go talk to the individual services or security apparatus of these different nations is critically important. And we will continue to do that over time. And again, like I said, we'll blend this between personal and virtual, because I think we've gained some ability to increase our partnership and increase our information sharing because of the virtual environment. But it's not one can't purely replace the other. So those activities, investments, exercises, foreign military funding, foreign military sales, all those things help build the security capabilities of these nations, which then allows economic activity. So those are things that we will do specifically on our end. Over.
Thank you. No, and I'm pained actually that we've only got 3 minutes remaining. I think that was one of the fastest 45 minutes I've had recently. So I do need to wrap up this conversation, and I think an appropriate way to wrap it up will be around the issue of cooperation, which is something I know both of our organizations are strongly committed to. So I think I'll ask you for a reflection, knowing that you have an incredible background, incredible experience. And so, General, if years from now, let's say, you had to share with students either from FIU, the U.S. Air Force Academy, or anywhere else going forward, one reflection based on your knowledge, your experience, your work in the region, specifically around security issues, what do you think that lesson would be?
The most important thing I think we do is exchanges of personnel, and for our command, I'll use professional military education as an example. So the most important thing we can do is invite members of other nations or members of our nation go to another nation, and they spend a year there, whether it's in an education forum or otherwise, bring their families, live in the culture, build friendships and an understanding of the nation's challenges, whether it's the United States or any other nation. And then you build that back into our enterprise so that we have regional experts that actually know what it's really like. You just can't replace it with a 2-week course or an online course. You actually have to be there and see it. And the one example I'll bring up is Ecuador, for instance. I was in Ecuador about 2 years ago as an Air Force representative as the air component. And I met the Ecuadorian Air Chief, and the Ecuadorian Air Force made it a point to find every Ecuadorian Air Force officer that actually attended the United States Air Force Academy and physically brought them to the building we were meeting and had me introduce myself to each one of the 7 officers. And that was a huge lift that they had to find these guys. They were not in the same place, by the way, to get them to come and say hello to me. Their English is great. They understand what our service does. They are academy graduates, as if they came out of the United States. Or we have our own officers that go live in other nations, Chile, Colombia, as an example, for a year or two. They come out of those assignments fully understanding the nuances of the challenges of a nation and the strengths of a nation that then make all organizations better. And they become very closely tied to us culturally and professionally. And that resonates throughout my entire career. I see it in Iraq. I see it in the Pacific. It is a universal truth that they gain a full understanding of our respective values. Even though our governments may not be necessarily aligned, but they are great friends, and their families understand it too. So that just builds over time. And I think it's probably one of our most powerful tools that we have in our toolbox, and we should continue to do that as much as we can. Thank you.
No, thank you. I can't think of a better way to end this conversation. Thank you so much for your service, for your reflections here today. Again, for me personally and professionally, it's been a great honor to be here with you in this conversation, General. Thanks to FIU again for the invitation to be here. I wish you all a very successful week. Some amazing panel speakers coming up. So Brian, thank you very much. I'm going to turn things over back to you.